The cafe was lively that morning, filled with the soft hum of conversation, the clatter of cups and saucers, and the occasional hiss of the espresso machine. The sunlight streamed through the large windows, casting a warm glow on the polished wooden tables and the worn but comfortable chairs. Most of the customers were regulars, the kind who came in not just for coffee, but for a place that felt like a second home. The aroma of freshly baked pastries mixed with the rich smell of coffee beans, creating a comforting atmosphere. She moved among the tables with practiced ease, carrying plates and cups with a gentle balance, smiling politely at the customers. She had been working there for a few years now, and she knew most of the regulars by sight. They greeted her with nods and friendly chatter, and she responded warmly, even when her feet ached from hours of standing. There was something about the cafe that felt safe and familiar, even on the days when the world outside seemed harsh and unwelcoming. Then he walked in. The moment he entered, the atmosphere seemed to shift slightly. He was a man who carried himself with a kind of confidence that bordered on arrogance. Expensive clothes, a perfectly tailored suit, and a presence that demanded attention. People in the cafe couldn't help but notice, some with admiration, others with quiet disapproval. He made his way to a table near the window, his sharp eyes scanning the room as if he owned it. She noticed him immediately, not because he was different, but because there was something in the way he looked at the room, as though he were already judging everyone. She took a deep breath, pushing aside any thoughts of intimidation, and approached his table with a warm, polite smile. "Good morning, sir. What would you like to order?" she asked, her voice steady and friendly. There was a hint of nervousness in her tone, but she tried to keep it hidden. He looked up at her and smirked, not a friendly one, but the kind that made her stomach twist. "Coffee, strong, black, and make it quick. I don't have time for nonsense." "Yes, sir," she replied, keeping her smile intact. She turned and walked to the counter, trying to steady her heartbeat. There was something in the way he carried himself, something sharp and dismissive, that made the air around him feel heavier. As she moved through the cafe, balancing a tray with pastries and coffee cups, she tried to focus on her rhythm, the little dance she had perfected over years of service. But fate, it seemed, had a way of testing patience at the most inconvenient moments. A regular customer reached across the table to grab a napkin, brushing against her elbow. The tray wobbled slightly, and before she could correct it, a small drop of coffee splashed onto the edge of the table near the Tycoon. For a moment, her heart stopped. She froze, hoping no one had noticed. But, of course, he had. His eyes narrowed, and a laugh escaped him, sharp and cutting. "Watch where you're going, would you?" he said, his voice loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "This is not a place for clumsy waitresses." The words stung more than the coffee spill itself. Some of the nearby customers shifted uncomfortably, not wanting to get involved but clearly feeling the tension. She forced herself to smile, to maintain composure, and quickly clean the spill. "I'm so sorry, sir," she said, her voice calm despite the embarrassment curling in her chest. "It won't happen again." But he wasn't satisfied. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms with a smug expression. "I doubt that. You should find a different job if this is the best you can do." His words were meant to humiliate, and they landed exactly as intended. The cafe, once a haven, now felt smaller, the walls closing in with the weight of his arrogance. She kept her eyes on him, nodding politely, and went back to her work. Each step felt heavier than the last, her hands trembling slightly as she refilled a customer's cup. She could hear his laughter, low and taunting, as he continued to mock her in subtle ways, making comments about the service, the decor, even the choice of music playing softly in the background. The other customers avoided eye contact, unsure how to react, while she tried to maintain the dignity she held onto like a lifeline. Inside, though, a quiet fire began to burn. She knew that she was more than the spill, more than the clumsy waitress he wanted to paint her as. There was a part of her, deep and private, that had nothing to do with carrying trays or serving coffee. She had a gift, one she had nurtured in secret for years, a talent that brought her peace and allowed her to express herself when words failed. Music. It had been her refuge through hard times, her companion through lonely nights, and now it whispered to her, promising a way to rise above the humiliation. She finished her shift with as much grace as she could muster, avoiding eye contact with the Tycoon whenever possible. Her mind, however, was elsewhere, replaying melodies and harmonies that only she could hear. Every note, every chord, felt like a lifeline, a reminder that she was more than this moment of ridicule. After the cafe quieted down in the afternoon, She made her way to the small corner where the old grand piano sat, mostly ignored by the patrons. Dust had settled on the keys, but she didn't mind. She ran her fingers lightly over them, feeling the familiar smoothness, and took a deep breath. This was her space, her sanctuary. Here, she could be herself, without fear, without judgment. As she began to play, the notes flowed naturally, each one carrying the weight of her day, the sting of humiliation, and the quiet determination that had kept her going through every challenge she had faced. The music was soft at first, almost tentative, as if testing the waters. But soon, it grew bolder, more confident, as her emotions poured out through her fingertips. The cafe, still open to a few lingering customers, seemed to fade away. Only the music existed, a testament to resilience, passion, and the quiet strength that had been underestimated by everyone who had seen only her uniform, and not her talent. Some patrons stopped to listen, drawn in by the unexpected beauty, unaware of the woman behind the performance. Even the Tycoon, still seated at his table, turned his head, curiosity flickering across his features. For the first time that day, the arrogance in his eyes met something it could not dismiss: genuine skill and emotion. The air in the cafe shifted again, this time filled with anticipation, admiration, and the quiet realization that appearances could be deceiving. And as she continued to play, a calm determination settled over her. She knew this was more than music. It was a statement, a quiet but undeniable declaration that she would not be defined by ridicule. The day had started with mockery, but it was about to be transformed by something far more powerful: the voice of her own talent, rising confidently, unapologetically, for all to hear. After finishing her shift, she felt a strange mix of exhaustion and relief. The cafe had finally started to empty, leaving only a few late customers lingering with their coffees. She wiped down the tables, carefully stacking the chairs and straightening the napkin holders. But her mind was already elsewhere, replaying the events of the day. The mocking words of the Tycoon still lingered, but beneath that sting, there was a spark, a quiet insistence that she would not let someone else's arrogance define her. She moved toward the corner where the old grand piano sat, its surface scratched and slightly dusty. It had been in the cafe for years, mostly unnoticed by the busy patrons who preferred the smell of coffee and the warmth of conversation to the soft promise of music. She ran her fingers over the keys, feeling the familiar resistance and weight, and smiled softly. Here, she could be herself. Here, there was no judgment, no mockery, just the pure, comforting sound of the piano responding to her touch. Her hands hovered for a moment, hesitant, as if testing her own courage. The memories of lessons long past and competitions she had quietly entered as a child flickered through her mind. She had always loved music, not for fame or recognition, but for the way it could express feelings words could never touch. Every chord, every note, was a language she understood intimately. She pressed down gently, and the first note rang out, clear and resonant, filling the quiet cafe with a sound that felt almost alive. It was soft at first, almost shy, but as her confidence grew, the melody became more certain, more expressive. She moved her hands across the keys, her fingers dancing, weaving patterns of sound that told stories of longing, hope, and quiet triumph. Some of the remaining customers noticed her playing and paused, caught by the unexpected beauty. A couple of people turned their heads, their conversations dwindling as they listened. The music seemed to ripple through the air, carrying an emotion that was impossible to ignore. It was not flashy or showy. It was sincere, heartfelt, and full of subtle power. She lost herself in the rhythm, the harmony, and the emotion of the piece. The piano became an extension of herself, a place where she could channel all the frustration and humiliation of the day into something productive and beautiful. Each note was a step away from the sting of ridicule, a step towards something greater and more personal. She could feel her heart beating in sync with the music, her worries fading into the melody. As she played, she began to imagine the life she wanted, far beyond the cafe and its confines. She pictured herself performing in concert halls, feeling the audience respond to every note with awe and appreciation. She thought of the freedom that music could bring, a life where she was seen not for a spilled cup or a polite smile, but for her talent, her dedication, and her passion. The music grew bolder, more expressive, carrying with it the quiet defiance that had been building inside her all day. She played a sequence of notes that rose and fell like a story unfolding, each phrase more intricate than the last. Her fingers moved with precision, yet there was a natural fluidity, a grace that only came from years of unseen practice. She could feel the strength in her own hands, the mastery she had cultivated in secret. Far away from prying eyes and cruel comments, a few customers had now stopped entirely, sitting back and listening, mesmerized by the sound. Some whispered to each other, pointing toward the piano, clearly impressed but unsure how to respond. The atmosphere of the cafe, once dominated by the bustling noise of conversation and clinking cups, had transformed into something different, almost reverent. The music demanded attention, and for the moment, everyone's eyes were on her. Even the Tycoon, still lingering at his table, had noticed the change. He looked up from his phone, his expression shifting from impatience to curiosity. The arrogance that had defined him moments ago softened slightly, replaced by something that might have been genuine intrigue. He leaned forward in his chair, listening more closely, his earlier smirk fading as he tried to understand the skill and emotion emanating from the piano. She didn't stop to see who was watching or to measure the impact of her performance. Her focus was entirely on the music, letting it guide her through the notes and chords she had memorized over the years. She explored the lower registers with deep, resonant tones, then moved to higher, lighter notes that floated through the air like delicate whispers. Each transition was deliberate, each pause meaningful, shaping the piece into a story that spoke to anyone willing to listen. Time seemed to slow as she played, the outside world fading into the background. The customers were drawn in, caught by the raw sincerity and technical skill of her performance. Even those who had once dismissed the cafe as ordinary could not help but be captivated. There was a power in the music that transcended the everyday, a reminder that beauty and talent often existed in unexpected places. She finished the piece with a gentle flourish, the final notes lingering in the air before fading into silence. The cafe remained quiet for a heartbeat, as if the room itself were taking a moment to absorb what had just happened. Then, slowly, a few claps began, soft at first, then growing louder as others joined in. Her heart swelled with a mixture of relief and pride. For the first time that day, she felt seen, not as a clumsy waitress, but as an artist with a voice that could move people. The Tycoon, still at his table, remained silent for a moment, processing what he had just heard. His expression had changed, softened by the undeniable talent he could no longer ignore. The pride and arrogance that had fueled his earlier mockery had no place here. The music demanded respect. Slowly, he nodded, a subtle acknowledgement that she had proven herself in a way he had not anticipated. She allowed herself a small, satisfied smile, knowing that this moment was just the beginning. Her music had spoken louder than any words, louder than ridicule or judgment. It had the power to change perceptions, to demand attention and respect, and she knew that it was only a matter of time before more people would hear the extraordinary talent she had kept hidden for so long. As the last notes faded and the clapping continued, she stood up from the piano, feeling lighter than she had all day. She walked back behind the counter, her movements calm and confident, and took a deep breath. The fire that had begun as a quiet spark within her had grown into something tangible, something that could not be ignored. She had found her voice, her strength, and her place, even in a world that sometimes tried to dismiss her. And for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of unstoppable possibility, ready to face whatever came next with courage, grace, and the quiet power of her music. The moment after the applause, the cafe seemed to hold its breath. The warmth of the afternoon sunlight filled the room, but it could not compete with the electric energy that the piano had created. Her hands were still lingering on the keys, feeling the vibration of each note, and her heart raced with the thrill of having shared something so personal. She knew the music had reached beyond words, beyond judgment, and she could see it in the faces around her. But not everyone was clapping. The Tycoon remained in his chair, leaning slightly forward with his arms resting on the table. He had been silent, and that silence carried weight. There was curiosity in his eyes, but also a hint of something else, something unspoken, almost like respect struggling to emerge. He cleared his throat, breaking the quiet, and spoke in a measured tone. "You play well." "Very well," she nodded politely, her cheeks flushed from the adrenaline and the lingering embarrassment of the morning. "Thank you, sir," she said softly, careful to keep her voice calm. She had learned that composure was just as powerful as talent, and at this moment, she wanted to show both. He studied her for a moment, as if trying to understand how someone so seemingly ordinary could hold such skill. His earlier arrogance was fading, replaced by a new kind of attention, the kind that came from realizing that appearances could be deceiving. The way he looked at her made her uneasy, but not afraid. She had learned long ago that fear could be a cage, and she refused to let it define her. "Would you play another piece?" he asked, leaning back slightly, his tone half challenge, half curiosity. "Something more complex. Let's see if that was just a lucky moment." For a heartbeat, she considered declining. She wasn't performing for him. She was playing for herself, for the music. But then she realized something important. This was an opportunity, not to prove anything to him specifically, but to show that her talent was real, deliberate, and unshakable. She took a deep breath, nodded, and returned to the piano, her fingers brushing the keys with confidence. The first notes were deliberate, precise, yet fluid, and they carried a story from the start. Her hands moved effortlessly, drawing out melodies that were intricate and expressive. The rhythm shifted, rising and falling like waves, each chord building tension and releasing it with a grace that felt natural yet extraordinary. The cafe, which had been filled with ordinary chatter only moments ago, became completely absorbed in the music. She noticed the other customers leaning forward, their cups forgotten, their eyes fixed on her hands moving across the keys. Some whispered quietly to each other, amazed at the depth and emotion of the performance. Even the barista paused mid-cleaning, silently admiring the way the melody carried both strength and subtlety, weaving a story that resonated with everyone present. The Tycoon, still seated at his table, now watched intently. There was a tension in his body, a silent acknowledgement that this was no mere coincidence, no random display of skill. Her fingers danced across the keys, creating harmonies that were both complex and accessible. Music that demanded attention not through flashiness but through substance. Each note seemed to carry a piece of her story, her struggle, and her perseverance. It was impossible to dismiss or ignore. She felt a quiet thrill as she played. The room was alive with sound, yet the attention of every listener was on the subtlety of the music. She moved from delicate, whispering passages to bold, commanding chords that resonated deeply. Her hands moved with a fluidity born of years of private practice, and for the first time that day, she allowed herself to feel proud without reservation. This was her moment, created not from performance pressure, but from genuine expression. The Tycoon's eyes widened slightly as he realized the depth of her talent. His previous smirk was gone, replaced by a mixture of surprise and a reluctant admiration. He shifted in his chair, unable to turn away, as if the music had put him in a rare position where he could only listen and acknowledge. For someone used to commanding attention, this was an unfamiliar sensation, but not unwelcome. She continued, letting the music rise and fall with emotion, each phrase more deliberate than the last. She included subtle variations, small flourishes that only someone intimately familiar with the instrument could produce naturally. It wasn't just technical skill, it was artistry, a true reflection of her inner life, her experiences, and her passion. Every chord was a statement, every pause a breath of quiet defiance against the assumptions others had tried to place upon her. The cafe seemed to dissolve around her. The background noise, the smells, the sunlight, everything faded into the periphery, leaving only the music and the people listening. She noticed some of the regulars' eyes glistening, moved by the emotion conveyed. Even the Tycoon, who had come in expecting arrogance and incompetence, was now leaning forward, fully captivated, his hands resting on the table, silent in a way that spoke volumes. As the piece progressed, she allowed herself a subtle improvisation, weaving unexpected chords and variations into the familiar structure of the melody. It was a moment of pure freedom, a reminder that her talent was not constrained by expectation or judgment. She was in control of her music, and by extension, her narrative. For years, she had been underestimated, overlooked, and dismissed, but here, at this piano, she had the power to command attention and respect. The final passage was both delicate and powerful, a combination that seemed to take the room by surprise. She played with a confidence that belied the nervousness she had felt only hours before, her fingers moving in a fluid dance across the keys. The notes lingered, creating a resonance that filled the cafe long after the last chord was struck. Silence followed, not awkward or empty, but full of awe and reflection. Then the room erupted into applause. It started quietly, a few claps that grew steadily as more people joined in. Inspired by the beauty they had just experienced, she allowed herself a small, humble smile, bowing slightly, acknowledging the response without arrogance. She had given them something real, something unforgettable, and that in itself felt like a triumph. The Tycoon remained silent for a moment, processing the performance. Then, slowly, he rose from his chair and approached the piano. His posture was different now, less commanding and more measured. He stopped in front of her, his gaze steady but not intimidating. "I underestimated you," he admitted quietly, almost as if saying it out loud made it more real. "That was remarkable, truly remarkable." She nodded politely, saying nothing, letting the music speak for itself. There was no need for flattery, no need for acknowledgement. Her talent was undeniable, and in that moment, she felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that her music had silenced the mockery and replaced it with admiration. He looked around at the other customers, who were still applauding and talking in hushed tones, clearly impressed. Then he looked back at her and, with a small, almost reluctant smile, took his seat again. He no longer carried the weight of arrogance. Instead, there was a subtle recognition of something genuine, something he had not expected to find in a cafe waitress. As she walked back behind the counter, her heart still racing from the performance, she felt a profound shift within herself. She had faced humiliation, she had faced mockery, and she had responded not with anger, but with artistry. She had shown that talent, determination, and authenticity could speak louder than words, louder than ridicule. And as she wiped down the counter and stacked the remaining cups, she knew that this was just the beginning. There were more stages, more people, more opportunities for her music to shine, and she was ready to embrace them, with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing her own worth. The cafe had quieted down completely by the time she returned to the piano. The remaining customers had settled into an attentive silence, captivated by the previous performance. Even the Tycoon, who had approached her earlier, had taken a seat nearby, watching with genuine curiosity. There was a new tension in the room, a sense that something significant was about to unfold. Even if no one could put it into words, she took a deep breath and placed her fingers on the keys. This was not a simple encore, it was a statement. She would play with everything she had, every emotion and memory embedded into her soul. The first notes were soft, almost whispering, drawing the listeners in. Each key she pressed seemed to release a fragment of her story, moments of doubt, resilience, and quiet determination that had shaped her into who she was. Her hands moved with fluidity, each chord deliberate yet natural. She explored the piano's entire range, dipping into deep, resonant bass notes that throbbed like a heartbeat, and then ascending into high, sparkling tones that floated through the room like sunlight. Her movements were confident, precise, and expressive, reflecting not just skill, but a deep understanding of the music itself. Every subtle shift, every delicate nuance, carried meaning. The Tycoon leaned forward slightly, his expression a mixture of surprise and admiration. He had seen talent before, but rarely with such unassuming presence and profound depth. There was no showiness here, no desire to impress. This was pure, genuine artistry. The arrogance that had dominated his demeanor all morning was replaced by something quieter, a recognition that he had been wrong to judge her so quickly. She allowed herself to close her eyes briefly, letting the music flow without restraint. The cafe seemed to transform around her. The clatter of cups, the whispering of other patrons, and even the distant sounds of the city outside faded into the background. In its place was a world created entirely by her fingers and imagination, a world where the audience could feel her emotions directly, as if each note were a word in a language they all instinctively understood. The melody swelled, rising and falling like waves crashing against a shore. It was bold, commanding attention, yet tender, drawing listeners closer to her inner world. She added unexpected flourishes, small improvisations that highlighted her mastery and creativity. Every gesture was intentional, every transition seamless. She was no longer just playing notes. She was telling a story, one that spoke of resilience, courage, and the quiet power of unrecognized talent. A few patrons had tears in their eyes, moved by the depth of feeling conveyed through the piano. Some leaned forward, listening intently, as if trying to absorb every detail. The energy in the cafe was palpable, a shared experience of awe and respect for something beautiful and genuine. The music had become a bridge, connecting everyone in the room to her story, even without words. The Tycoon remained motionless, his earlier smugness replaced by a rare humility. He could not look away, unable to dismiss the skill, passion, and authenticity he was witnessing. It was a humbling experience, one that challenged the assumptions he had carried into the cafe that morning. For someone so used to control and power, it was a new feeling, to be captivated and silenced by another's talent. She transitioned into a section that was delicate and introspective, allowing each note to linger, to breathe, and to resonate with the listeners. The sound seemed to wrap around the room, gentle yet insistent, commanding attention without demanding it. It was in these quiet moments that her music spoke most powerfully, revealing vulnerability and strength simultaneously. She felt herself pouring every ounce of emotion into the performance, transforming her personal experiences into something universal. Then, without warning, she shifted into a series of rapid, intricate passages that showcased her technical mastery. Her fingers moved with astonishing speed, accuracy, and grace, yet the music never felt mechanical. It was alive, expressive, and thrilling, leaving the audience in awe. Every person in the cafe was leaning in, some unable to hide their amazement, others whispering to themselves in disbelief. The combination of skill and emotion created a moment that felt almost sacred. The Tycoon's face betrayed a mixture of astonishment and respect. He had mocked her earlier, expecting clumsiness and incompetence, but now he was confronted with undeniable brilliance. There was a moment of silence in his mind, a pause where pride, arrogance, and judgment gave way to admiration. He realized that talent and character could be hidden beneath the most unassuming appearances, and he felt a quiet pang of regret for having misjudged her. She allowed the music to reach a climax, powerful yet controlled, filling every corner of the cafe with sound and emotion. Her hands moved with precision and passion, creating harmonies that resonated deeply with the audience. The energy in the room was electric, the shared experience uniting everyone in a rare moment of collective appreciation. Even those who had come in for a simple coffee were now witnesses to something extraordinary, something they would not forget. As the final notes rang out, she held them just long enough to let the resonance settle, then let her hands rest gently on the keys. The cafe was silent for a heartbeat, as if the world itself were acknowledging the performance. Then, slowly, applause erupted, growing louder and more enthusiastic with each passing second. The sound was not just appreciation for skill, but a recognition of courage, authenticity, and the profound impact of her music. The Tycoon stood, clapping slowly at first, then with more vigor. He approached her once more, his expression softer now, tinged with genuine respect. "That was incredible," he said quietly, his tone almost reverent. "I misjudged you this morning. You have a rare gift, and it is impossible to ignore." She nodded, accepting the words with grace. There was no need for vanity, no need for argument. The music had spoken for her, silencing the earlier ridicule and replacing it with recognition and respect. She had turned a moment of humiliation into a testament to her resilience, skill, and quiet strength. The other customers continued to clap, some whistling softly, others exchanging impressed glances. There was an energy in the room, a shared sense of wonder and appreciation that lingered long after the final note. For a moment, the cafe had been transformed into a space where talent, dedication, and emotion could shine without constraint. She stepped away from the piano, her hands still tingling from the performance, and walked back behind the counter. Her movements were calm, confident, and natural. She had faced mockery, humiliation, and doubt, and had emerged not only unbroken but elevated. Her talent undeniable. The experience had shifted something within her, a quiet understanding that she had the power to change perceptions and command respect through her art. The Tycoon returned to his table, no longer carrying the weight of arrogance or impatience. He sipped his coffee thoughtfully, clearly processing what he had witnessed. The morning had begun with judgment and mockery, but now it had ended with admiration, reflection, and a newfound awareness of the value of humility and recognition of hidden talent. As she continued her work behind the counter, refilling cups and tidying tables, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had shared a part of herself that could not be taken lightly, a voice that demanded acknowledgement. The music had been more than performance. It had been a declaration of who she was, a quiet but undeniable statement of her worth. And as the cafe returned to its ordinary rhythm, she carried with her the knowledge that her talent could not be ignored, that her music had the power to transform even the most unlikely of audiences. The cafe had returned to its usual rhythm, but the energy lingered in the air. Conversations were quieter, more reflective, as if everyone had been touched by the music that had filled the room earlier. The waitress moved among the tables with a calm confidence, refilling cups and straightening chairs. Yet her mind was still wrapped around the performance she had just given. It had been a turning point, a moment that would remain etched in her memory forever. The Tycoon, who had arrived with arrogance and a desire to belittle, now sat quietly at his table, sipping his coffee with a thoughtful expression. His earlier mockery had vanished, replaced by a sense of respect and humility. He watched her for a while, clearly impressed by not only her skill, but also the grace with which she carried herself. The realization that he had misjudged her began to sink in, and with it came a quiet regret for his behavior earlier in the day. As she finished her shift and began preparing to leave, a few customers lingered, approaching her with smiles and words of appreciation. Some thanked her for the beautiful music, others expressed amazement at her talent. She accepted each compliment with a gentle nod and a quiet smile, feeling a mixture of pride and humility. This was the first time her music had reached such an audience, and the recognition felt both surreal and deeply satisfying. The Tycoon approached her once more before leaving. His demeanor was different now, stripped of the arrogance that had marked their first encounter. "I want to apologize," he said sincerely. "I judged you too quickly. That performance, it was incredible. You have a gift that should be shared far beyond this cafe." She looked at him, seeing the genuine regret in his eyes. There was no need for words to defend herself or justify her talent. The music had spoken for her, silencing mockery and commanding respect. "Thank you," she replied simply, her voice steady. "I appreciate that." He nodded and left, but the encounter left a lasting impression on both of them. For him, it was a lesson in humility, a reminder that talent and character cannot be measured by appearances or first impressions. For her, it was a confirmation that her perseverance, skill, and authenticity could overcome doubt and criticism, and that her music had the power to move and inspire. Over the following days, news of her performance began to spread. Regular customers spoke of it to friends, and soon people from outside the cafe came to hear the young woman who could play with such emotion and skill. Invitations to local events and community performances arrived, each one an opportunity to share her music with a wider audience. She accepted them cautiously at first, unsure of what to expect, but each experience reinforced her confidence and love for performing. She practiced diligently, not to prove herself to anyone, but to honor the gift she had been given. Music had always been her refuge, a place where she could express what words could not, and now it had become a bridge to others, connecting her to people who appreciated and understood her art. Each performance was an opportunity to convey emotion, to tell a story, and to touch hearts in ways she had only dreamed of before. The cafe, once just a place of work, had transformed into a stage, a sanctuary where her talent could shine. The regular patrons watched her with admiration, proud to witness the growth of someone they had known in a different context. The atmosphere of the cafe changed, too, becoming one of encouragement and respect, where talent was nurtured and celebrated rather than dismissed or mocked. She found herself thinking less about the Tycoon's initial mockery and more about the impact her music could have. The memory of that morning, which had begun with humiliation, had become a catalyst for growth, determination, and recognition. It reminded her that talent and dedication could break through barriers, even in moments when the world seemed dismissive or harsh. Opportunities began to multiply. She was asked to perform at small local concerts, community gatherings, and private events. Each performance reinforced the confidence she had gained, and she found herself enjoying the connection with her audience more than she had ever imagined. People came not just to hear music, but to experience emotion, to be moved by her story and her skill. She realized that her journey was about more than recognition. It was about sharing a piece of herself through every note. Through it all, she remained humble and grounded, never forgetting the quiet strength that had carried her through years of practice and perseverance. She treated every audience with respect, every note with care, and every opportunity with gratitude. Her life had changed in ways she had never expected, yet she approached each new challenge with the same dedication and love for music that had always driven her. The Tycoon's presence became less frequent in her thoughts, replaced by the excitement of future performances and the joy of connecting with others. Through music, he had served as an unlikely catalyst, a reminder that judgment and arrogance could exist, but that genuine talent and authenticity could not be denied. His initial mockery had been transformed into an opportunity for recognition, growth, and affirmation of her abilities. She continued to play at the cafe, sometimes performing for the regular customers, who had become like a small community of supporters. Each day, her confidence grew, her technique became more refined, and her ability to convey emotion through music deepened. The piano, once a quiet companion in moments of solitude, had become a voice that resonated far beyond the walls of the cafe, reaching the hearts of everyone who listened. As time went on, she realized that her journey was not just about personal achievement, but about inspiring others. People who had come to the cafe or heard her perform began to speak of her dedication and skill, often expressing how her music had touched them personally. She became a quiet example of resilience and talent, someone who had faced mockery and doubt yet emerged stronger and more accomplished. Looking back, she understood that the day the Tycoon mocked her had been a turning point, not because of his opinion, but because it had forced her to step fully into her own abilities. She had responded not with anger, but with artistry, transforming a moment of ridicule into a lasting testament to her talent. That day, and the music that followed, had opened doors she had never imagined, revealing a path where passion, perseverance, and authenticity could lead to extraordinary opportunities. Her life continued to evolve, each performance a new chapter, each audience a new connection. She had found her voice, her purpose, and her place in the world. And through it all, she carried with her the quiet confidence that comes from knowing one's own worth, the joy of sharing a gift with others, and the understanding that true talent shines brightest when it is nurtured, respected, and allowed to flourish.